Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Collaborative IEP podcast. I'm Ashley Barlow, your host, and I am so happy you are here. We're in the kitchen today. I needed to change the pace. I get a lot done right here at the end of my kitchen island. So here we are. Hooray. I might have to get up to stir some soup too. So it's a multi-purpose change of location for today. So, friends, I have had a lot of people asking me about UFLI. And I have also had a lot of cases in the last year where I have gotten the opportunity to, let's say, talk to teams about implementation of specially designed Orton Gillingham interventions. And so we're going to go down like a little OG path here. I'm really excited about it because this is also why I went down an OG path myself. You might remember, but a little history here. So I, it- about, I don't know, 3 years ago, and then 2 years prior to that, just had this slew of reading cases here in my legal practice in Kentucky, as well as my advocacy practice across the country. And I was like really kind of struggling because I would ask the questions that I knew to ask, and I still wasn't like getting to the heart of the issue. I still felt like we left meetings with like big question marks. And what I would do is I would go home and read. I would dive into curriculum guides. I would call advocate friends. I have a lot of advocate friends that specialize just in reading. Like they only help people in the reading community and in the SLD community and the dyslexia community and the twice exceptional community. And I would call them and be like, okay, so they want to do this program but the kid is experiencing this and something's not lining up. And then they would help me design more questions to ask or design more things to say in order to get the kid, different advocacy. And I was like, okay, so what I clearly need to do is I need to learn more about the science of reading and specifically the actual implementation of Orton Gillingham. And so, I thought the best way to do that is to learn. So, as you probably know, I got trained a few years ago in Orton Gillingham myself. So, what I am trained in is IMSE, the Institute of Multisensory Education. Their OG Plus training is $1,500. It's online, not sponsored. And I say this all the time. It was seriously the 30 most intense education hours of my life. I found it to be so fulfilling, so educational, so challenging, and just incredibly helpful for my practice of law and my advocacy work, whatever. They're very similar and very parallel jobs that I have. Just depends on what state I'm in, really. And so, but I did the training and I loved it and it gave me so much information, but I was like, I need to live, eat, and breathe this because I have a lot of kids that need modifications to this curriculum. And so I was like, what do? I got to tutor kids. And so I provided OG Tier 3 similar one-on-one interventions for a summer. I think I had 5 kids and I loved that. Holy cow, my door just opened. It's just wind. And I loved that. And I was like, I want to keep doing that. And so I have continued to do that with Jack Barlow on and off. I'm his mom. So we definitely don't do it with fidelity, but we do it. And I have just learned a ton about it. So what I want to do is I want to start talking about, I want to give you insight into UFLI, which is the University of Florida. It's an acronym, okay? It's the University of Florida Literacy Institute, UFLI. It is not YOUFLY, but I suspect it's a play on words like you fly ... into reading. If I was their marketing person, that's what I would be doing. but it's also the University of Florida Literacy Institute. Okay. But if your child needs reading interventions or needs to make better progress in reading, I think that this little series that we're going to do is going to help you, because I'm going to talk about UFLI, but I'm trained in IMSE, so I'm also going to talk about IMSE. And IMSE in particular is something that Orton Gillingham has given its stamp of approval. So that's where we're going to start, is this Orton Gillingham ideology. And I really want for you to understand that we are also then going to get into like what UFLI looks like and how to implement UFLI, and then specific questions that you can ask if your child isn't making progress in reading, isn't making quick enough progress in reading, is struggling with various aspects to reading, that kind of thing. Okay. Because the theme here is, I think it takes more nitty gritty knowledge of what OG compliant interventions look like in order to successfully advocate for the implementation of OG with fidelity at school. Okay. So I'm going to say that again. So when a child is struggling and you say either he needs Orton Gillingham reading from the very beginning, or the OG that you are providing school people is not sufficient enough for his progress, then, and if we know OG is right for the kid, right, then I'm going to try to give you specific questions through the insight of what OG actually looks like, so that you can get over the hurdle with whatever part of that intervention and instruction is not particularly working. Okay. So that's where we are. I'm going to do this in little short burst episodes, but there are a few where I'm like, oh, that might be a long one. So I don't know how long this series is going to be, because I started to map it out and I was like, I mean, it's mapped out, but I just don't know where I'm going to draw the breaks. Anyway, this is our first break. Let's learn a little bit more about the products that we have here at the Collaborative IEP. Okay, step one was kind of hard. I am recording on just one screen, and I usually use my other screen, but since I'm in my kitchen, what's a girl to do? I logged in to my outline on my phone. Cognitive flexibility, people. So, okay. So the first thing is, like, what is Orton Gillingham, right? And I want for you to know it's basically two things. Orton Gillingham is an approach, and it is a business that grants approval to use the Orton Gillingham name to certain proprietary curricula. Okay. So it is an approach and it is a business. Here's a parallel. So you might say, I am going to eat a plant-based diet. That is an approach. I am going to, what's that mean? Well, that's an ideology. That the idea is yours and yours alone. I used to say, I only eat what God makes. I don't eat processed foods. And people would say, oh, that's so healthy. And I'm like, well, is it? Because God made bacon. And so, and like for me, I didn't ever look to make sure that my bacon was like totally chemical free. But I pretty much do eat what God makes, right? So that is an ideology. That was also a tangent. But the approach is, I follow the Whole30, which is not a plant-based diet, but you see what I mean? That is a proprietary diet. Right now, I am about 80-20 on the Galveston diet, which is it's supposed to help menopausal women like grouchy old me. So the approach is, let's say my approach is not plant-based diet, but my approach is clean eating, and my proprietary brand is the Galveston diet. Okay. So the approach is the ideology or the idea, and the proprietary brand is like Wilson is an OG program, or Barton, or IMSE, or OG Academy. Those are proprietary brands. And there is this thing that I'm going to talk to you about in a second that gives it stamp of approval and says, yes, you can officially call this Orton Gillingham. And in order to be Orton Gillingham approved, it has to have certain characteristics. Okay. So you've probably heard people say, then we use OG, or we're OG trained, or we're OG certified. There is a difference between being trained and being certified, by the way. Did you know? I think that maybe just taught you something. So today we're talking about the difference in approach, the difference between the approach and the business or brand of Orton Gillingham. Okay. And we say OG because that's the acronym for Orton Gillingham. Okay. So let's talk about OG as an approach, or OG as an ideology. So Orton Gillingham, very simply, is a structured multisensory approach to literacy instruction, to the teaching of reading, but all components of reading, which altogether we call literacy, which was originally designed for students with dyslexia. It is not a single approach. It is more a methodology, an ideology, and approach. So it isn't like one single program, but it is this idea or this methodology, this framework, if you will. OG has several core characteristics. So I'm going to list them for you and then we'll go through them. Multisensory, explicit, sequential and systematic, cumulative, diagnostic and prescriptive, structured but flexible. Okay, so I'm going to read you the list again, and then we'll go through them. Multisensory, explicit, sequential and systematic, cumulative, diagnostic and prescriptive, and structured but flexible. Okay, so that is 6 different characteristics. I oftentimes just list out 5. When I was writing my outline to give you this podcast episode, diagnostic and prescriptive came up, and I was like, yes, actually, when I think about diagnostic and prescriptive, I'm like, that is a really key component to implementing an Orton Gillingham curriculum with fidelity. And so I don't know if I'll be able to retain that to memory because I've said the other 5 for so long in meeting, but I definitely think diagnostic and prescriptive is an important thing to talk about. So let's talk about each of those. And then we're going to talk about OG as a business and like the stamp of approval from OG. And then that'll wrap up today's episode. So multisensory. So Orton Gillingham, it is at its core a multisensory experience. When I was taught how to be a teacher from 1996 to 2000, at Miami University, the Harvard of the Midwest. And don't you ever call that Miami of Ohio. Have we ever talked about that, friends? Have we ever talked about Miami University, established in 1809 in Oxford, Ohio? Well, here's what you need to know. Miami was a university before Florida was a state. So the other Miami, you know, the Hurricanes, that university was created after Miami University. In fact, the entire state of Ohio was founded. What do you call that when somebody gets their like their like municipality, you know, indoctrinated? No, that's not the right word. Oh no, I made a thumbs up. No, but it was wrong. So thumbs down. I'm not going to take the emojis off the screen. I just kind of like them, and I don't want to take them off. Anyway, whatever states get, Miami, here's what the t-shirt says. Miami University, Miami was a university before Florida was a state. And that's what's important. So if you start calling it Miami of Ohio, I'm in a bone to pick with you. Anyway, why did we start talking about that? Oh, when I was taught to be a teacher in 1996, 1996 to the year 2000, I was taught, you know, somebody's a kinesthetic learner or they're a visual learner or they're whatever. And now, we're like, hey, how about if you try to, this is like a concept of universal design for learning. if we try to teach most things and we capitalize on the various strengths of learners, their visual profiles and their auditory profiles and their oral profiles and their kinesthetic profiles, and we try to tier instruction such that we are hitting the kids that might need extension and the kids that might need remediation, well, hallelujah, we might reach the majority of our learners. And so that's one of the concepts of UDL, Universal Design for Learning. It is also a core component to Orton-Gillingham instruction. The instruction should be multisensory, meaning that we are saying things, we are writing things, we are otherwise feeling things, we are hearing things, and we are seeing things. We are doing just about everything but tasting them. I don't think I've ever seen OG implemented with a ton of vestibular input or proprioceptive input, but with Jack Barlow, I absolutely use proprioceptive input. For example, sometimes we throw words. So I have these little bean bags and I put words on them and I say, why don't you throw snap? And it's a great way to receptively get him access to a reading curriculum and let him do basically what he wants to do, but also what he needs. He needs to feel stuff. And so he gets to feel a heaviest beanbag and then, we do it. Another thing we do is we have a medicine ball and we throw the medicine ball back and forth and we read a word and then we throw the medicine ball. So I actually am making it proprioceptive. I just didn't ever think about it. Okay. So Orton-Gillingham then is multi-sensory. Okay. And we're going to get into the nitty gritty so that you know how to ask, is it multi-sensory? Like in IMSE, there's this thing called a 3-part drill. And at UFLI, they do like an auditory drill and a visual drill. And then we're going to talk about what those look like so that you can ask the appropriate questions to be like, is it multi-sensory? Because if you just ask, is it multi-sensory? They'll be like, oh, yes, ma'am. Okay, well, I need to know what that means, like nitty gritty in practice. It is explicit. So no guessing. Everything is taught directly. Like literally when I was taught OG by IMSE, my teacher would basically like read from a script. It would be something like eyes on me. And then she would work into the curriculum. So A says, ah. And then the students would choral back. A says, ah. E says, F. And then the students will choral back. E says, F. And then O says, ah. O says, ah. And the students will choral that back, right? So it is explicit. The nice thing to having a curriculum is that you literally can open the book and be like, here's what I do today. It is day 1 of lesson 35, and here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I introduce a new concept. Here is how I work through a decodable reader. Here is how I do all of these things, right? So that's what we're going to talk about, like without sharing anything proprietary. UFLI is completely free and available online. So that one I can do, but without sharing any like trade secrets of IMSE, which you have to pay for. I really hope to give you kind of like that peeled back version of what's this look like so that you can ask the appropriate questions. Okay, so explicit. Sequential and systematic. This is super duper important. Systematic means that there's like, that it's very deliberate, right? Like it follows a system. It is founded in research. So this is kind of where you get the evidence-based component to it. Like there is a reason why we do things in a certain order. And then the sequential is we do it in this order. And this is why it's really important that you don't pull a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this. So you can't do a little bit of Wilson, a little bit of reading recovery, a little bit of Barton, a little bit of Linda Mood Bell. You can't do that because then you lose the sequence. So you've probably heard that curricula have something called a scope and sequence. This is the idea of sequential and systematic. So in IMSE, for example, you start with, I think the order of the phonemes is M-A, L-O, maybe H-G. So the first letter that you teach to kindergartners in the IMSE curriculum is M. And then there is a very specific way that you teach the letter M. And then the next letter that you teach, the next sound is A, short A vowel sound. There's a very specific way that you teach A, and you do the same thing on Monday and the same thing on Tuesday and the same thing on Wednesday, so that the kids really kind of get like accustomed to the instruction. Then a huge component to the sequential nature of Orton Gillingham and many other curricula, but this Orton Gillingham ideology is that no, the students are not given any words or any nonsense words or combination of words that they have not had before. And this really helps with automaticity and fluency. So eventually, I think I don't remember what lesson is in OG and in my binders and on my desk, but like by lesson, I don't know, 15 or 12 or something, you can start with this thing called decodable readers. So the decodable readers are specifically tied to the scope and sequence and introduced adjacent to, like within the scope and sequence. And the kids are only reading words that they should know how to read, which then influences the previous lessons, right? So there's this idea of spiraling where we're going back by way of these decodable readers, we're going back and we're looking at previous lessons learned because we're looking at previous phonemes and previous spelling rules and previous blends and all of those things, the syllabication that gets involved and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it is sequential and systematic, which then leads to this idea of cumulative. Remember when you had a test in college and the professor would say, it's cumulative, and you were like, oh no, it's cumulative. Well, what cumulative means is that it is comprehensive. So with Orton Gillingham, what it means, so like a cumulative test was that it was based on the entire semester's worth of work, not just the work for that one particular, unit or lesson, right? So in Orton Gillingham, what it means is that we're going to go back and revisit lesson 1 by way of lessons that are in lesson 45, because we're going to get that sound in practice with lesson 45, because, if lesson 45 is SH, then a word might be mash. Well, guess what? We're practicing lesson 1, which has the sound to it. Okay. So it builds on itself. It has that spiral. And again, remember the sequential part of it. We don't get anything new until we've covered it. So the decodable readers are really, really deliberate. All right. So that's a cumulative piece of it. Diagnostic and prescriptive means that it responds to student performance and reteaches as needed. So in IMSE in particular, you don't move on until, if you're doing this as an intervention with one student, you don't move on until the student has reached 80% accuracy. So, and with your class, it's got to be like I think it's the majority. I've never needed to teach tier 1, but I think if recollection serves me correctly, with IMSE, you don't move on until the majority of your class reaches tier 1, and then you go back and provide additional review and support to the kids that did not reach 80% on the Friday assessment. Okay. So this is a big place where we modify. So I just did a what do you call it? Assessment with Jack. And Jack, for the beginning, like the kindergarten and first grade curriculum, he's at 100%, 100%, 100% on the assessment. Then some of the harder concepts come in, and he was getting like 60%, 80%, 90%, 80% as we worked our way through the scope and sequence and tested for various lessons. Excuse me. Well, Jack is not a super consistent kid. Like, he does not show you super consistently what he knows. It's just part of his learning profile. It's part of the way that he is. He's not consistent about anything. He's not consistent about what he likes and doesn't like or anything. He is consistent about what time he goes to sleep, and that's about it. And Mexican food at his favorite restaurant in Skyline Chili here in Cincinnati. Oh, and Grater's milkshake. Okay, so he's consistent. He's very loyal to certain things. But you know what I'm saying. This is not an episode about Jack Barlow. So I had to look at it very critically and think about it and say, okay, so I think where I would plug him into the scope and sequence of this particular curriculum, if I were doing so, would be right here, where he is starting to get more consistent 60%. But I also think we can skip these lessons where he got 90% if we continue to really spiral back to hit these 60% often. So I had to kind of like think about you have to use a little bit of gut judgment and you have to be able to modify. Okay. So this prescriptive thing is really, really important though. And then structured yet flexible, right? So again, the curriculum, like, and this is what I want to peel back for you. Cause you're like, is it structured? And they say, oh, yes, it sure is structured. And you're like, but how? Can you describe it to me? Okay. So then to wrap up the components of OG, again, is multisensory, explicit, sequential and systematic, cumulative, diagnostic and prescriptive, and structured but flexible. If a curriculum has those components, it can unofficially be considered an Orton Gillingham based curriculum. But in order to have the stamp by OG, it has to have been approved, so to speak, by Orton Gillingham, the business. So let's move on to OG as the brand, in other words, the business side. So Orton Gillingham is a professional organization that offers training and certification. The Orton Gillingham Academy is what this thing's called. It used to have a different acronym, AOGPE, I think. I forget how people said that. But anyway, the Orton Academy provides trainings in and of itself. And it certifies teachers at various levels. So remember how I said there's a difference between being trained and being certified? So you can be a classroom educator, you can be an associate, a certified OG practitioner, or even a fellow. And all of those things take various levels of trainings and hands-on experience with students. In order to be certified, you have to have done the training, done a certain amount of hours with students under the supervision of a like OG practitioner. When I first got trained, I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to train other people. And, but I would have had to go through all the other steps, which would have meant like basically abandoning this job for a while to provide the hands-on instruction to people. And that is something that my career can't sustain. So it does not work out for me, but I really think that would be enriching and fulfilling. So the OG business basically sets the standards for what instruction should look like in order to be considered Orton Gillingham instruction. So like what should OG look like? That is, excuse me, that what the business does. I keep trying to hit my computer when I'm looking down at my notes because remember how they're on my phone. So what this means for parents relative to the business side is that a teacher can be OG trained through the OG Academy program. It also means that teachers can call themselves Orton Gillingham trained if they did something that got the OG stamp of approval, like IMSE, IMSE. Now, that leads us to say, well, what about UFLI? So UFLI does not yet have the OG stamp of approval, to my knowledge and to my research to prepare for this. But I feel like almost everybody in the dyslexia community, in the Orton Gillingham community, in the larger ideological component of like science of reading think, yes, UFLI is going to be OG compliant. It'll get the stamp of approval once there's enough evidence to say that it works. But it is so close to other OG compliant programs that it is going to get that stamp of approval. So it just newer, and so it doesn't have. That's kind of my my mentality. And when I say that to other people in the profession, they're like, yes, they agree with that. So, okay, practical takeaways before we go here. And I got to get out to a doctor's appointment, which is why I'm making my coffee. I feel cozier in doctor's appointments if I take coffee. So, this is my third cup. And as you can probably tell by the pace of my language, I probably don't need a third cup. Um, so, we're going to get into the nitty gritty. And I'm going to give you questions to ask for each one of these things. We're going to go back through those core things and we're going to like really open the lens. Sorry, I'm stirring in a metal can. Open the lens so that you can see like what this looks like in practicality. But what I want for you to understand, kind of like key takeaways from this, and my screen went black, is you can ask about the characteristics, not just like, is it OG? How is it multisensory? That kind of stuff. If you need this like right now, then go on the UFLI website and look at their daily lesson plan, and that'll give you more background to that. So the certification is great, but it's really kind of the like fidelity to the Orton Gillingham approach that really matters. And so, okay, so with this information, then what we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit deeper into UFLI specifically, because I think it's really popular right now. And I have a lot of cases where we're asking questions about UFLI, but then also kind of run parallels to other programs like Wilson and Lindenwood Bell and Barton and IMSE and all of those things, so that you really understand how to ask questions about whether or not your child is getting an Orton Gillingham approach and whether or not it is being implemented with fidelity. I'll see you next week, same time, same place.